This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Scott. The Anti-Federalist Papers, Section 49. The Impartial Examiner, Letter 1. The Impartial Examiner, Virginia Independent Chronicle, Letter 1, 20 February, 1788. To the Free People of Virginia, Countrymen and Fellow Citizens, that the subject which has given rise to the following observations is of the highest consequence to this country, requires not the aid of logical proof, that it merits the most serious attention of every member of this community, is a fact not to be controverted. Will not a bare mention of the new federal constitution justify this remark? To foreigners or such whose local connections form no permanent interest in America, this may be totally indifferent, and to them it may afford mere matter of speculation and private amusement. When such advert to the high and distinguished characters who have drawn up and proposed a set of articles to the people of an extensive continent as a form of their future government, an emotion of curiosity may induce them to examine the contents of those articles, and they may, perhaps, from having contemplated on a former situation of those people, that they had struggled against a potent enemy, that they had, by their virtuous and patriotic exertions, rescued themselves from impending danger, that they had used like endeavors to establish for themselves a system of government upon free and liberal principles, that they had in pursuance of those endeavors chosen a system as conducive to the great ends of human happiness, the preservation of their natural rights and liberties, that this system has prevailed but few years, and now already a change, a fundamental change therein, is meditated. Strangers, I say, having contemplated on these circumstances, may be led to consider this nation as a restless and dissatisfied people, whose fickle, inconsistent minds suffer them not to abide long in the same situation, whose perpetually seeking after new things throw away one blessing in pursuit of another, and while they are thus indulging their caprice, lose all, ere any can ripen into maturity. If the unconcerned part of those among us entertain themselves in this manner, can any good American be content to deserve such reflections? Will not all rather feel an honest indignation if they once perceive their country stamped with a character like this? And yet, may we not justify such conceptions, if we thus precipitate ourselves into a new government before we have sufficiently tried the virtues of the old? So incident is error to the human mind, that it is not to be wondered at indeed if our present Constitution is incomplete. The best regulated governments have their defects, and might perhaps admit of improvement, but the great difficulty consists in clearly discovering the most exceptionable parts, and judiciously applying the amendments. A wise nation will therefore attempt innovations of this kind with much circumspection. They will view the political fabric which they have once reared as the sacred palladium of their happiness. They will touch it as a man of tender sensibility toucheth the apple of his own eye. They will touch it with light, with a trembling, with a curious hand, lest they injure the whole structure in endeavoring to reform any of its parts. In small and trivial points alterations may be attempted with less danger, but where the very nature the essence of the thing is to be changed, when the foundation itself is to be transformed, and the whole plan entirely new modeled, should you not hesitate, O Americans? Should you not pause and reflect a while on the important step you are about to take? Does it not behoove you to examine well into the nature and tendency of the Constitution now proposed for your adoption, and by comparing it with your present mode of government, endeavor to distinguish which of the two is most eligible, whether this or that is best calculated for promoting your happiness, for obtaining and securing those benefits which are the great object of civil society? Will it be consistent with the duty which you owe to yourselves as a nation, or with the affection which you ought to bear for your posterity, if you rashly or inconsiderately adopt a measure which is to influence the fate of this country for ages yet to come? How will it accord with your dignity and reputation as an independent people, if either through an overweening fondness for novelty you are suddenly transported on the wings of imagination, and too hastily make up your thoughts on this great subject, or by sinking into a listless inactivity of mind, view it as an indifferent matter unworthy of any deliberate consideration? Will any respect, will any honor, will any veneration be due to the memory of yourselves as ancestors, if millions of beings who have not yet received their birth, when you are all moldered into dust, should find themselves fixed in a miserable condition by one injudicious determination of yours at this period? If you see no impropriety in these questions, the suggestions contained in them will not appear altogether unworthy of attention. One moment's reflection, it is humbly presumed, will render it obvious that on this occasion they are not impertinently propounded. In pursuing this address, I beg leave to premise that the only true point of distinction between arbitrary and free governments seems to be, that in the former the governments are invested with powers of acting according to their own wills, without any other limits than what they themselves may understand to be necessary for the general good, whereas in the latter they are entrusted with no such unlimited authority, but are restrained in their operations to conform to certain fundamental principles, the preservation whereof is expressly stipulated for in the civil compact, and whatever is not so stipulated for is virtually and impliedly given up. Societies so constituted invest their supreme governors with ample powers of exerting themselves according to their own judgment in everything not inconsistent with or derogatory to those principles, and so long as they adhere to such restrictions, their deeds ought not to be rescinded or controlled by any other power whatsoever. Those principles are certain inherent rights pertaining to all mankind in a state of natural liberty, which through the weakness, imperfection, and depravity of human nature cannot be secured in that state. Men therefore agree to enter into society, that by the united force of many the rights of each individual may be protected and secured. These are in all just governments laid down as foundation to the civil compact, which contains a covenant between each and all, that they shall enter into one society to be governed by the same powers, establishes for that purpose the frame of government, and consequently creates a convention between every member binding those who shall at any time be entrusted with power to a faithful administration of their trusting according to the form of the civil policy which they have so constituted, and obliging all to due obedience therein. There can be no other just origin of civil power but such mutual contract of all the people; and although their great object in forming society is an intention to secure their natural rights, yet the relations arising from this political union create certain duties and obligations to the state, which require a sacrifice of some portion of those rights and of that exuberance of liberty which obtains in a state of nature. This, however, being compensated by certain other adventitious rights and principles which are acquired by the social connection, it follows that the advantages derived from a government are to be estimated by the strength of the security which is attained at once with the least sacrifice and the greatest acquired benefits. That government, therefore, which is best adapted for promoting these three great ends must certainly be the best constituted scheme of civil policy. Here, then, it may not be improper to remark that persons forming a social community cannot take too much precaution when they are about to establish the plan of their government. They ought to construct it in such a manner as to procure the best possible security for their rights. In doing this, they ought to give up no greater share than what is understood to be absolutely necessary; and they should endeavor so to organize, arrange, and connect its several branches, that when duly exercised, it may tend to promote the common good of all, and contribute as many advantages as the civil institution is capable of. It has been before observed that the only just origin of civil power is a contract entered into by all the people for that purpose. If this proposition be true, and I dare presume it is not controverted, at least in this country, right reason will always suggest the expediency of adhering to the essential requisites in forming that contract upon true principles. A cautious people will consider all the inducements to enter into the social state, from the most important object down to the minutest prospect of advantage. Every motive with them will have its due weight. They will not pay a curious attention to trifles, and overlook matters of great consequence. And in pursuing these steps, they will provide for the attainment of each point in view with a care, with an earnestness proportionate to its dignity, and according as it involves a greater or lesser interest. It is evident, therefore, that they should attend most diligently to those sacred rights which they have received with their birth, and which can neither be retained to themselves nor transmitted to their posterity unless they are expressly reserved; for it is a maxim, I dare say, universally acknowledged, that when men establish a system of government, in granting the powers therein, they are always understood to surrender whatever they do not expressly reserve. This is obvious from the very design of the civil institution, which is adopted in lieu of the state of natural liberty, wherein each individual, being equally entitled to the enjoyment of all natural rights, and having equally a just authority to exercise full powers of acting, with relation to other individuals, in any manner not injurious to their rights, must, when he enters into society, be presumed to give up all those powers into the hands of the state, by submitting his whole conduct to the direction thereof. This being done by every member, it follows, as a regular conclusion, that all such powers whereof the whole were possessed, so far as they related to each other individually, are of course given up by the mere act of union. If this surrender be made without any reservation, the conclusion is equally plain and regular, that each and all have given up, not only those powers which relate to the others, but likewise every claim which pertained to themselves as individuals; for the universality of the grant in this case must necessarily include every power of acting and every claim of possessing or obtaining anything, except according to the regulations of the state. Now a right being properly defined, a power or claim established by law, to act or to possess or to obtain something from others. For every natural right is such a power or claim established by the law of nature. Thus it is manifest, and in a society constituted after this manner, every right whatsoever will be under the power and control of the civil jurisdiction. This is the leading characteristic of an arbitrary government, and whenever any people establish a system like this, they subject themselves to one which has not a single property of a free constitution. Hence results the necessity of an express stipulation for all such rights as are intended to be exempted from the civil authority. Permit me now, my countrymen, to make a few observations on the proposed Federal Constitution. In this attempt, the subject, as it is arduous and difficult, naturally impresses the modest mind with diffidence; yet being of the last importance, as involving in it the highest interest that freemen can have, all that is dear and valuable to the citizens of the United States, a consciousness of the strong claim which this subject has to a free and general discussion, has prevailed over that discouraging idea so far as to produce the present address to you. This is done with a reliance on that benevolence and liberality of sentiment with which you have hitherto been actuated. From these benign qualities it is hoped the most favorable indulgence will be granted, and that the zeal with which this is written will be allowed in some measure as excuse for its defects. However imperfect, therefore, this may be, however inadequate to your own ideas or to the wishes of him who offers it to your consideration, you are hereby entreated to let the perusal with which you may think proper to favor it be serious, candid, dispassionate, as it relates to a common cause in which we are all concerned. Suffer me then in the first place to advert to a point of the 6th article in this Constitution. It may perhaps appear somewhat irregular to begin with this article, since it is almost the last proposed; yet if it be considered that this at once defines the extent of congressional authority, and indisputably fixes its supremacy, every idea of impropriety on this head will probably vanish. The cause alluded to contains the following words: "This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all the treaties made, or which shall be made, under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every State shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any State to the contrary notwithstanding." If this Constitution should be adopted here, the sovereignty of America is ascertained and fixed in the federal body at the same time that it abolishes the present independent sovereignty of each state. Because this government, being general and not confined to any particular part of the continent, but pervading every state and establishing its authority equally in all, its superiority will consequently be recognized in each, and all other powers can operate only in a secondary subordinate degree. For the idea of two sovereignties existing within the same community is a perfect solecism. If they be supposed equal, their operation must be commensurate and like two mechanical powers of equal momenta counteracting each other. There the force of the one will be destroyed by the force of the other, and so there will be no efficiency in either. If one be greater than the other, they will be similar to two unequal bodies in motion with a given degree of velocity, and impining each other from opposite points. The motion of the lesser in this case will necessarily be destroyed by that of the greater, and so there will be efficiency only in the greater. But what need is there for a mathematical deduction to shew the impropriety of two such distinct, coexisting sovereignties? The natural understanding of all mankind perceives the apparent absurdity arising from such a supposition, since, if the word means anything at all, it must mean that supreme power which must reside somewhere in state, or, in other terms, it is the united powers of each individual member of the state collected and consolidated into one body. This collection, this union, this supremacy of power can, therefore, exist only in one body. This is obvious to every man, and it has been very properly suggested that under the proposed Constitution each state will dwindle into the insignificance of a town corporate. This certainly will be their utmost consequence, and as such they will have no authority to make laws, even for their own private government, any further than the permissive indulgence of Congress may grant them leave. This, Virginians, will be your mighty, your enviable situation after all your struggles for independence. And if you take the trouble to examine, you will find that the great, the supereminent authority with which this instrument of union proposes to invest the federal body is to be created without a single check, without a single article of convention for the preservation of those inestimable rights which have in all ages been the glory of freemen. It is true, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this Union a republican form of government. Yet they do not guarantee to the different states their present forms of government, or the Bill of Rights thereto annexed, or any of them, and the expressions are too vague, too indefinite, to create such a compact by implication. It is possible that a republican form of government may be built upon as absolute principles of despotism as any Oriental monarchy ever yet proposed. I presume that the liberty of a nation depends not on planning the frame of government, which consists merely in fixing and delineating the powers thereof, but on prescribing due limits to those powers and establishing them upon just principles. It has been held in a northern state by a zealous advocate for this Constitution that there is no necessity for a Bill of Rights in the federal government, although at the same time he acknowledges such necessity to have existed when the constitutions of the separate governments were established. He confesses that in these instances the people invested their representatives with every power and authority which they did not in explicit terms reserve, but in delegating federal powers, says he, everything which is not given is reserved. Here is a distinction I humbly conceive, without a difference, at least in the present enquiry. How far such a discrimination might prevail with respect to the present system of union, it is immaterial to examine. And had the observation been restrained to that alone, perhaps it might be acknowledged to contain some degree of propriety. For under the Confederation it is well known that the authority of Congress cannot extend so far as to interfere with or exercise any kind of coercion on the powers of legislation in the different States, but the internal police of each is left free, sovereign, and independent, so that the liberties of the people, being secured as well as the nature of their constitution will admit, and the Declaration of Rights which they have laid down as the basis of government having their full force and energy, any further stipulation on the head might be unnecessary. But surely, when this doctrine comes to be applied to the proposed federal constitution, which is framed with such large and extensive powers as to transfer the individual sovereignty from each State to the aggregate body, a constitution which delegates to Congress an authority to interfere with and restrain the legislatures of every State, invests them with supreme powers of legislation throughout all States, annihilates the separate independency of each, and, in short, swallows up and involves in the plenitude of its jurisdiction all other powers whatsoever. I shall not be taxed with arrogance in declaring such an argument to be fallacious, and insisting on the necessity of a positive, unequivocal declaration in favor of the rights of free men in this case even more strongly than in the case of their separate governments. For it seems to me that when any civil establishment is formed, the more general its influence, the more extensive the powers with which it is invested, the greater reason there is to take the necessary precaution from securing a due administration and guarding against unwarrantable abuses. End of Section 49. The Impartial Examiner, Letter 1. Recording by Robert Scott, June the 20th, 2007. Vox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Scott, The Anti-Federalist Papers, Section 50, Impartial Examiner, Letter 2. Impartial Examiner, Letter 2, 27 February 1788, continued from our last. Section 8th of the first article gives the Congress a power to, lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. If it be a true maxim that those who are entrusted with the exercise of the higher powers of government ought to observe two essential rules: first, in having no other view than the general good of all without any regard to private interest. And secondly, to take equal care of the whole body of the community, so as not to favor one part more than the other. It is apparent that under the proposed Constitution, this general Confederate society, made up of 13 different states, will have very little security for obtaining an observance either of the one or of the other rule. For being different societies, though blended together in legislation, and having as different interests, no uniform rule for the whole seems to be practicable, and hence it is to be feared that the general good may be lost in a mutual attention to private views. From the same causes we may lament the probability of losing the advantage of the second rule, for it may be expected in like manner that the general care of the whole will be lost by separate endeavors of different legislators to favor their own states. So long as mankind continues to be influenced by interest, the surest means of effecting a union of councils in any assembly is by a union of interests. Now, if it be considered that it is this concert, that it is this union in promoting the general good, which alone can preserve concord in this great republic, and secure its success and glory, unhappy will be the situation of America if she once precludes the beneficial effects of such a good understanding. Yet I apprehend that these evils may result in a great measure from an exercise of that branch of legislative authority which respects internal direct taxation. For in this it is scarcely probable that the interest, ease, or convenience of the several states can be so well consulted in the federal assembly as in their own respective legislatures. So different are many species of property, so various the productions, so unequal the profits arising, even from the same species of property in different states, that no general mode of contribution can well be adopted in such a manner as at once to affect all in an equitable degree. Hence may arise disagreeable objects of contention. A diversity of interests will produce a diversity of schemes. Thus, each state, as it is natural, will endeavor to raise a revenue by such means as may appear least injurious to its own interest. A source of dissension manifestly detrimental to the harmony which is necessary to support the Confederation. I cannot conceive it impracticable to reform the federal system in such a manner as to ensure a compliance with the necessary requisitions of Congress from the different state legislatures. Then all the several states being left to raise their own share of the revenue, and being the only proper judges of the mode most convenient to themselves, it is highly probable that this important branch of government would be carried on more generally to the satisfaction of each state, and would tend to promote a spirit of concord between all the parts of this great community. Because each being thus accommodated and participating the advantages of the Union, none subjected to any inconvenience thereby, all would consequently concur in nourishing an affection for the government which so cemented them. I believe it is acknowledged that the establishment of excise has been one of the greatest grievances under which the English nation has labored for almost a century and a half. Although this may seem an economical tax arising out of manufactures, from which the industrious may derive advantages, and whereof the wealthy, by consuming the greatest share, will of course contribute the largest proportion of the tax. Yet the nature of it being such as requires severe laws for its execution, it has justly become an object of general detestation. This has induced Judge Blackstone to declare that, "the rigor and arbitrary proceedings of excise laws seems hardly compatible with the temper of a free nation." While therefore you are free men, while you are unused to feel any other power, by such as can be exercised within the bounds of moderation and decency, it doubtless behooves you to consider whether it is an eligible step to subject yourselves to a new species of authority, which may warrant the most flagrant violations of the sacred rights of habitation. If this branch of revenue takes place, all the consequent rigor of excise law will necessarily be introduced in order to enforce a due collection. On any charges or offense in this instance, you see yourselves deprived of your boasted trial by jury. The much admired common law process will give way to some quick and summary mode, by which the unhappy defendant will find himself reduced, perhaps to ruin, in less time than a charge could be exhibited against him in the usual course. It has ever been held that standing armies in times of peace are dangerous to a free country, and no observation seems to contain more reason in it. Besides being useless, as having no object of employment, they are inconvenient and expensive. The soldiery, who are generally composed of the dregs of the people, when disbanded or unfit for military service, being equally unfit for any other employment, become extremely burdensome, as they are a body of men exempt from the common occupations of social life, having an interest different from the rest of the community. They wanton in the lapse of ease and indolence, without feeling the duties which arise from the political connection, though drawing their subsistence from the bosom of the state. The severity of discipline necessary to be observed reduces them to a degree of slavery. The unconditional submission to the commands of their superiors, in which they are bound, renders them the fit instruments of tyranny and oppression. Hence they have in all ages afforded striking examples of contributing more or less to enslave mankind, and whoever will take the trouble to examine will find that by far the greater part of the different nations who have fallen from the glorious state of liberty owe their ruin to standing armies. It has been urged that they are necessary to provide against sudden attacks. Would not a well-regulated militia, duly trained to discipline, afford ample security? Such I conceive to be the best, the surest means of protection which a free people can have when not actually engaged in war. This kind of defense is attended with two advantages superior to any other. First, when it is necessary to embody an army, they at once form a band of soldiers, whose interests are uniformly the same with those of the whole community, and in whose safety they see involved everything that is dear to themselves. Secondly, if one army is cut off, another may be immediately raised, already trained for military service. By a policy somewhat similar to this, the Roman Empire rose to the highest pitch of grandeur and magnificence. The Supreme Court is another branch of federal authority which wears the aspect of imperial jurisdiction, clad in a dread array, and spreading its wide domain into all parts of the continent. This is to be coextensive with the legislature, and like that is to swallow up all other courts of judicature. 4. What is that judicial power which, shall extend to all cases in law and equity, in some having, original, in all others, appellate jurisdiction, but an established universal in its operation? And what is that, appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact, but an establishment which may in effect operate as original jurisdiction? Or what is an appeal to inquire into facts after a solemn adjudication in any court below, but a trial de novo? And do not such trials clearly imply an incompetency in the inferior courts to exercise any kind of judicial authority with rectitude? Hence, will not this eventually annihilate their whole jurisdiction? Here is a system of jurisprudence to be erected, no less surprising than it is new and unusual. Here is an innovation which bears no kind of analogy to anything that Englishmen or Americans, the descendants of Englishmen, have ever yet experienced. Add to all that this high prerogative court establishes no fundamental rule of proceeding except that the trial by jury is allowed in some criminal cases. All other cases are left open, and subject, to such regulations as the Congress shall make. Under these circumstances, I beseech you all, as citizens of Virginia, to consider seriously whether you will not endanger your solemn trial by jury, which you have long revered as a sacred barrier against injustice, which has been established by your ancestors many centuries ago, and transmitted to you as one of the greatest bulwarks of civil liberty, which you have to this day maintained inviolate. I beseech you, I say, as member of this commonwealth, to consider whether you will not be in danger of losing this inestimable mode of trial in all those cases wherein the Constitution does not provide for its security. Nay, does not that very provision, which is made by being confined to a few particular cases, almost imply a total exclusion of the rest? Let it then be a reflection deeply impressed on your minds, that if this noble privilege, by which long experience has been found the most exquisite method of determining controversies according to the scale of equal liberty, should once be taken away, it is unknown what new species of trial may be substituted in its room. Perhaps you may be surprised with some strange piece of judicial polity, some arbitrary method, perhaps confining all trials to the entire decision of the magistrate, and totally excluding the great body of the people from any share in the administration of public justice. To be continued. End of section 50. Recorded by Robert Scott, June the 22nd, 2007. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Scott. The Anti-Federalist Papers, section number 51, Impartial Examiner, letter 3. Impartial Examiner, Letter 3, 5th of March, 1788. Concluded from our last. After the most deliberate reflections on this important matter, permit me, my dear countrymen, to declare to you, in the most unfeigned manner, that not perceiving anything in the proposed plan of government which seems calculated to ensure the happiness of America, I could not, as a fellow citizen, resist the inclination to impart these sentiments to you, unmoved by party, rage, unassailed by passion, uninfluenced by any other interest but the genuine effusal of zeal for this our common country. I confess to you in the language of sincerity and candor that after the first reading of this new code I could not behold it but with an eye of disapprobation. Unwilling, however, to reject at first sight an object of such high moment, I resolved to distrust the propriety of a construction passed on so early a period. This led me to pursue it with the utmost diligence I was capable of, and believe me, the foregoing observations have risen from the fullest conviction that the system involves in it the most dangerous principles, and so far from exalting the standard of American liberty, I fear that, should it be adopted, this glorious work, which already has cost the lives of many worthy patriots, will ere long be leveled with the dust. Let it not be conjectured from hence that any illiberal conceptions are formed by the writer hereof respecting the intentions of those gentlemen who have offered this plan of federal government. He knows no circumstance inducing him to suppose they had any other object in view but the good of their country. When we contemplate the great, the magnanimous hero, who has conducted our armies through all the trying vicissitudes of danger and difficulty, there is no man so disingenuous, there is no man so ungrateful as to impute any transactions of his to sinister motives. Every true American is well assured that steadiness of virtue, that benignity of soul, have the chief rule in all his actions. Yet every American and every other person are satisfied also that there is no infallibility in human nature. To be man is to be subject to error. The best, the greatest, the wisest are liable to commit mistakes. Let it be remembered, then, that this code of government is solemnly proposed to every free man in America. For what? For the purpose of binding them without their approbation? No. For an implicit acceptance? No. For their adoption merely in compliment to the general convention? No. What then? Every man's duty to his country points out to him the end of this proposition. Every man knows that it is for a free, a candid, and impartial discussion and determination thereon, whether they will approve and adopt it, or whether they will disapprove and reject it. Can any citizen, therefore, be so weak? Can any be so timid, so pusillanimous as to acknowledge that he has no right to exercise his own judgment with regard to this matter? If there should be any haughty spirits among us who think that this subject ought to be handled by none but a few persons of eminent character, let such recollect that the dignity, the importance of their country should inspire sentiments more exalted than the highest characters, sentiments that should correspond with the worth of America, not with the consequence of any mere individuals. Will you then, Virginians, arrogate too much by boldly asserting the privilege to judge for yourselves in what so nearly concerns the cause of liberty. No, no, my countrymen, you will not arrogate too much. You will not. I avow it by the souls of those brave patriots who fought for the same cause in the late war. You will in this affair act as becomes you. The rank you hold amongst the nations of the earth requires this of you, and you will forfeit that rank. You will forfeit the character of free men, and shew that you deserve to be enslaved if you decline that privilege. The happiness of a multitude of people is certainly the highest advantage, and if you will contribute a full share of duty to effect this, so shall you obtain a due share of glory. No pomp of character, no sound of names, no distinction of birth, no preeminence of any kind should dispose you to hoodwink your own understandings, and in that state suffer yourselves to be led at the will of any other men whatsoever. The part you have acted heretofore, the brave, the noble efforts you have made, are proof enough of your fortitude, and totally exclude every idea of pusillanimity. Herein you have evinced the highest sense of public virtue. Herein you have manifested to the whole world that the cause of liberty has hitherto had the prevailing influence over your hearts. And shall men, possessed of these sentiments, shall those valiant defenders of their country, who have not feared to encounter toil and danger in 1,000 shapes, who have not startled even at the prospect of death itself, shall you, O Virginians, shall you, I say, after exhibiting such bright examples of true patriotic heroism, suddenly become inconsistent with yourselves, and will fail to maintain a privilege so incontestably your due? No, my countrymen, by no means can I conceive that the laudable vigor which flamed so high in every breast can have so far evaporated in the space of 5 years. I doubt not, but you will in this trying instance acquit yourselves in a manner worthy of your former conduct. It is not to be feared that you need the force of persuasion to exercise a proper freedom of enquiry in the merits of this proposed plan of government, or that you will not pay a due attention to the welfare of that country for which you have already so bravely exerted yourselves. Of this I am well assured, and do not wonder when imagination presents to my view the idea of a numerous and respectable body of men reasoning on the principles of this federal Constitution. If herein I conceive that you are alarmed at the exceedingly high and extensive authority which it is intended to establish, I cannot but see the strongest reasons for such apprehensions. For a system which is to supersede the present different governments of the States by ordaining that, laws made in pursuance thereof shall be supreme, and shall bind the judges in every State. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any State to the contrary notwithstanding, must be alarming indeed. What cannot this omnipotence of power effect? How will your Bill of Rights avail you anything? By this authority the Congress can make laws which shall bind all, repugnant to your present Constitution, repugnant to every article of your rights, for they are a part of your Constitution, they are the basis of it, so that if you pass this new Constitution, you will have a naked plan of government unlimited in its jurisdiction, which not only expunges your Bill of Rights by rendering ineffectual all the State governments, but is proposed without any kind of stipulation for any of those natural rights, the security whereof ought to be the end of all governments. Such a stipulation is so necessary that it is an absurdity to suppose any civil liberty can exist without it, because it cannot be alleged in any case whatsoever that a breach has been committed, that a right has been violated, as there will be no standard to resort to, no criterion to ascertain the breach, or even to find whether there has been any violation at all. Hence it is evident that the most flagrant acts of oppression may be inflicted, yet still there will be no apparent object injured. There will be no unconstitutional infringement. For instance, if Congress should pass a law that persons charged with capital crimes shall not have a right to demand the cause or nature of the accusation, shall not be confronted with the accuser or witnesses, or call for evidence in their own favor, and a question should arise respecting their authority therein, can it be said that they have exceeded the limits of their jurisdiction, when that has no limits, when no provision has been made for such a right, when no responsibility on the part of Congress has been required by the Constitution? The same observation may be made on any arbitrary or capricious imprisonments contrary to the law of the land. The same may be made if excessive bail should be required, if excessive fines should be imposed, if cruel and unusual punishment should be inflicted, if the liberty of the press should be restrained. In a word, if laws should be made totally derogatory to the whole catalogue of rights which are now secured under your present form of government. You will doubtless consider whether the inconveniences may not be very disagreeable, and perhaps injurious, to which this country may be subjected by excise laws, by direct taxation of every kind, by the establishment of feudal courts. You will advert to the dangerous and oppressive consequences that may ensue from the introduction of standing armies in times of peace, those baneful energies of ambition, against which free nations have always guarded with the greatest degree of caution. You will determine likewise as to the propriety of being excluded from keeping ships of war without the consent of Congress. This situation of these States renders a naval force extremely desirable, being bounded on one side by the sea. Their coasts are accessible to every lawless adventurer, and without ships to guard them, they are subject to continual depredations. The expediency of this species of defense is manifest. The great advantages to be derived from it, the strength, the consequence which it adds to a nation, are such that every well-wisher to this country would rejoice to see a large navy established, as the circumstances of the state can at any time admit of. This, therefore, seems to be a very improper restraint upon the States, a restraint which may perhaps eventually prove very injurious. Upon the whole, my fellow citizens, if you judge this proposed Constitution to be eligible or ineligible, you will accordingly instruct your delegates when they are about to meet in convention. The wisdom of the legislature has judged it advisable to fix the time for deciding on this momentous business at the distance of several months, that you may become thoroughly acquainted with a subject which so nearly concerns your greatest interests. I know it is a favorite topic with the advocates for the new government, that it will advance the dignity of Congress, and that the energy which is now wanting in the feudal system will be hereby rendered efficient. Nobody doubts but the government of the Union is susceptible of amendment. But Can anyone think that there is no medium between want of power and the possession of it in an unlimited degree? Between the imbecility of mere recommendatory propositions and the sweeping jurisdiction of exercising every branch of government over the United States to the greatest extent? Between the present feeble texture of the Confederation and the proposed nervous ligaments? Is it not possible to strengthen the hands of Congress so far as to enable them to comply with all the exigencies of the Union, to regulate the great commercial concerns of the continent, to superintend all affairs which relate to the United States in their aggregate capacity, without devolving on that body the supreme powers of government in all its branches? The original institution of congressional business, the nature, the end of that institution, evince the practicability of such reform, and shew that it is more honorable, more glorious, and will be more happy for each American State to retain its independent sovereignty. For what can be more truly great in any country than a number of different States in the full enjoyment of liberty, exercising distinct powers of government, yet associated by one general head, and under the influence of a mild, just, and well organized confederation duly held in equilibria, whilst all derive those external advantages which are the greatest purpose of the Union? This separate independency existing in each, this harmony pervading the whole, this due degree of energy in the federal department, all together will form a beautiful species of natural grandeur. These will add luster to every member, and spread a glory all around. These will command the admiration of mankind. These will exhibit a bright specimen of real dignity, far superior to that immense devolution of power under which the sovereignty of each State shall shrink to nothing. It requires no great degree of knowledge in history to learn what dangerous consequences generally result from large and extensive powers. Every man has a natural propensity to power, and when one degree of it is obtained, that seldom fails to excite a thirst for more. A higher point being gained, still the soul is impelled to a further pursuit. Thus, step by step, in regular progression, she proceeds onward until the lust of domination becomes the ruling passion and absorbs all other desires. When any man puts himself under the influence of such a passion, it is natural for him to seek after every opportunity, and to employ every means within reach for obtaining his purpose. There is something so exceedingly bewitching in the possession of power that hardly a man can enjoy it, and not be affected after an unusual manner. The pomp of superiority carries with it charms which operate strongly on the imagination. Nay, it is a melancholy reflection that too often the very disposition itself is transformed, and for the gratification of ambitious views, the mild, the gentle, humane, the virtuous becomes cruel and violent, losing all sense of honor, probity, humanity, and gratitude. Hence, should it not be a maxim, never to be forgotten, that a free people ought to entrust no set of men with powers that may be abused without control, or afford opportunities to designing men to carry dangerous measures into execution, without being responsible for their conduct? And as no human foresight can penetrate so far into future events as to guard always against the effects of vice, as the securest governments are seldom secure enough, is it not the greatest imprudence to adopt a system which has an apparent tendency to furnish ambitious men with the means of exerting themselves, perhaps to the destruction of American liberty? It is next to impossible to enslave a people immediately after a firm struggle against oppression, while the sense of past injury is recent and strong. But after some time this impression naturally wears off, the ardent glow of freedom gradually evaporates, the charms of popular equality, which arose from the republican plan, insensibly decline, the pleasures, the advantages derived from the new kind of government grow stale through use. Such declension in all these vigorous springs of action necessarily produces a supineness. The altar of liberty is no longer watched with such attentive assiduity. A new train of passions succeeds to the empire of the mind. Different objects of desire take place, and if the nation happens to enjoy a series of prosperity, voluptuousness, excessive fondness for riches, and luxury gain admission and establish themselves, these produce venality and corruption of every kind, which open a fatal avenue to bribery. Hence it follows that in the midst of this general contagion a few men, or one, more powerful than all others, industriously endeavor to obtain all authority, and by means of great wealth, or embezzling the public money, perhaps totally subvert the government, and erect a system of aristocratical or monarchic tyranny in its room. What ready means for this work of evil are numerous standing armies and the disposition of the great revenue of the United States. Money can purchase soldiers, soldiers can produce money, and both together can do anything. It is this depravation of manners, this wicked propensity, my dear countrymen, against which you ought to provide with the utmost degree of prudence and circumspection. All nations pass this paroxysm of vice at some period or another, and if at that dangerous juncture your government is not secure upon a solid foundation, and well guarded against the machinations of evil men, these liberties of this country will be lost perhaps forever. Let us establish a strong federal government, which shall render our Congress a great and eminent body, says one. By all means, replies another, and then they will command the attention of all Europe. Who, pray, what will it avail you in the hour of distress, in the midst of calamity, though all Europe should pay attention to the Congress? What advantage will it be to the citizens of America should they elevate Congress to the highest degree of grandeur, should the sound of that grandeur be wafted across the Atlantic and echo through every town in Europe? What will the pomp, the splendor of that dignified body profit you, I say, if you place yourselves in a situation which may terminate in wretchedness? Of what consequence will that state of congressional preeminence be to you, or to your posterity, if either the one or the other should thereby be reduced to a mere herd of— O great God, avert that dreadful catastrophe! Let not the day be permitted to dawn which shall discover to the world that America remains no longer a free nation. O let not this sacred asylum of persecuted liberty cease to afford a resting place for that fair goddess. Reanimate each spirit that languishes in the glorious cause. Shine in upon us and illuminate all our counsels. Suffer thy bright ministers of grace to come down and direct us. And hovering for a while on the wings of affection, breathe into our souls true sentiments of wisdom, that in this awful, this important moment, we may be conducted safely through the maze of error, that a firm basis of national happiness may be established and flourish in undiminished glory through all the succeeding ages. End of section 51. Recorded by Robert Scott, June the 23rd, 2007. LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Scott. The Anti-Federalist Papers, Section number 52, Letter number 4, A Farmer. A Farmer, Baltimore, Maryland Gazette, Letter 4, March 18, 1788. The opposite qualities of the first confederation were rather caused by than the cause of two parties, which from its first existence began and have continued their operations, I believe, unknown to their country and almost unknown to themselves, as really but few men have the capacity or resolution to develop the secret causes which influence their daily conduct. The old Congress was a national government and a union of states, both brought into one political body. As these opposite powers, I do not mean parties, were so exactly blended and very nearly balanced, like every artificial, operative machine where action is equal to reaction. It stood perfectly still. It would not move at all. Those who were merely confederal in their views were for dividing the public debt. Those who were for national government were for increasing of it. Those who thought any national government would be destructive to the liberties of America assisted those who thought it our only safety to put everything as wrong as possible. Requisitions were made which everybody knew it was impossible to comply with. Either in 82 or 83, 10 millions of hard dollars, if not 13, were called into the Continental Treasury, when there could not be half that sum in the whole tract of territory between Nova Scotia and Florida. The states neglected them in despair. The public honor was tarnished, and our governments abused by their servants and best friend. In fine, it became a cant word, things are not yet bad enough to mend. However, as a great part of the important objects of society were entrusted to this mongrel species of general government, the sentiment of pushing it forward became general throughout America, and the late convention met at Philadelphia under the uniform impression that such was the desire of their constituents. But even then, the advantages and disadvantages of national government operated so strongly, although silently, on each individual that the conflict was nearly equal. A third or middle opinion, which always arises in such cases, broke off and took the lead. The national party, thus assisted, pursued steadily their object. The federal party dropped off one by one, and finally, when the middle party came to view, the offspring which they had given birth to, and in a great measure reared, several of them immediately disowned the child. Such has been hitherto the progress of party, or rather of the human mind, dispassionately contemplating our separate and relative situation, and aiming at that perfect completion of social happiness and grandeur, which perhaps can be combined only in ideas. Every description of men entertain the same wishes, except perhaps a very few bad men of each. They forever will differ about the mode of accomplishment, and some must be permitted to doubt them practicably. As our citizens are now apprised of the progress of parties or political opinions on the continent, it is fit they should also be informed of the present state, force, and designs of each, in order that they may form their decisions with safety to the public and themselves. This shall be given with all the precision and impartiality that the author is capable of. America is at present divided into three classes or descriptions of men, and in a few years there will be but two. First, the first class comprehends all those men of fortune and reputation who stepped forward in the late Revolution from opposition to the administration rather than the government of Great Britain. All those aristocrats whose pride disdains equal law. Many men of very large fortune who entertain real or imaginary fears for the security of property. Those young men who have sacrificed their time and their talents to public service without any prospects of an adequate pecuniary or honorary reward. All your people of fashion and pleasure who are corrupted by the dissipation of the French, English, and American armies, and a love of European manners and luxury, the public creditors of the continent, whose interest has been heretofore sacrificed by their friends in order to retain their services on this occasion. A large majority of the mercantile people, which is at present a very unformed and consequently dangerous interest. Our old native merchants have been almost universally ruined by the receipt of their debts in paper during the war, and the payment in hard money of what they owed their British correspondents since peace. Those who are not bankrupts have generally retired and given place to a set of young men, who, conducting themselves as ravishingly as ignorantly, have embarrassed their affairs and lay the blame on the government, and who are really unacquainted with the true mercantile interest of the country, which is perplexed from circumstances rather temporary than permanent. The foreign merchants are generally not to be trusted with influence in our government. They are, most of them, birds of passage. Some perhaps British emissaries, increasing and rejoicing in our political mistakes, and even those who have settled among us with an intention to fix themselves and their posterity in our soil, have brought with them more foreign prejudices than wealth. Time must elapse before the mercantile interest will be so organized as to govern themselves, much less others, with propriety. And lastly, to this class, I suppose we may ultimately add the Tory interest, with the exception of very many respectable characters, who reflect, with a gratification mixed with disdain, that those principles are now become fashionable for which they have been persecuted and hunted down, which, although by no means so formidable as is generally imagined, is still considerable. They are at present wavering. They are generally, though with very many exceptions, openly for the proposed, but secretly against any American government. A burnt child dreads the fire. But should they see any fair prospect of confusion arise, these gentry will be off at any moment for these 25 years to come. Ultimately, should the administration promise stability to the new government, they may be counted on as the Janissaries of power, ready to efface all suspicion by the violence of their zeal. In general, all these various people would prefer a government as nearly copied after that of Great Britain as our circumstances will permit. Some would strain these circumstances. Others still retain a deep-rooted jealousy of the executive branch and strong Republican prejudices, as they are called. Finally, this class contains more aggregate wisdom and more virtue than both the other two together. It commands nearly 2/3 of the property and almost 1/2 of the numbers of America, and has at present become almost irresistible from the name of the truly great and amiable man who, it has been said, is disposed to patronize it, and from the influence which it has over the second class. The first class is nearly at the height of their power. They must decline or moderate, or another revolution will ensue, for the opinion of America is becoming daily more unfavorable to those radical changes which high-toned government requires. A conflict would terminate in the destruction of this class, or the liberties of their country. May the guardian angel of America prevent both. Second, the second class is composed of those descriptions of men who are certainly more numerous with us than in any other part of the globe. First, those men who are so wise as to discover that their ancestors, and indeed all the rest of mankind, were and are fools. We have a vast overproportion of these great men, who, when you tell them that from the earliest period at which mankind devoted their attention to social happinesses, it has been their uniform judgment that a government over governments cannot exist. This is two governments operating on the same individual. Assume the smile of confidence, and tell you of two people traveling the same road, of a perfect and precise division of the duties of the individual. Still, however, the political apothegm is as old as the proverb, that no man can serve two masters, and whoever will run their noodles against old proverbs will be sure to break them, however hard they may be. And if they broke only their own, all would be right. But it is very horrible to reflect that all our numbskulls must be cracked in concert. Second, the trimmers, who from sympathetic indecision are always united with, and when not regularly employed, always fight under the banners of these great men. These people are forever at market, and when parties are nearly equally divided, they get very well paid for their services. Thirdly, the indolent, that is almost every second man of independent fortune you meet in America. These are quite easy, and can live under any government, if men can be said to live, who scarcely breathe, and if breathing was attended with any bodily exertion, would give up their small portion of life in despair. These men do not swim with the stream as the trimmers do, but are dragged like mud at the bottom. As they have no other weight than their tat flesh, they are hardly worth mentioning when we speak of the sentiments and opinions of America. As the second class never can include any of the yeomanry of the Union, who never affect superior wisdom, and can have no interest but the public good, it can only be said to exist as the birth of government. And as soon as the first and third classes become more decided in their views, this will divide with each and dissipate like a mist, or sink down into what are called moderate men, and become the tools and instruments of others. These people are prevented by a cloud from having any view, and if they are not virtuous, they at least preserve the appearance, which in this world amounts to the same thing. Third, at the head of the third class appear the old rigid Republicans, who, although few in number, are still formidable. Reverence will follow these men in spite of detraction, as long as wisdom and virtue are esteemed among mankind. They are joined by the true Democrats, who are in general fanatics and enthusiasts, and some few sensible, charming madmen. A decided majority of the yeomanry of America will, for length of years, be ready to support these two descriptions of men. But as this last class is forced to act as a residuary legate, and receive all the trash and filth, it is in some measure disgraced and its influence weakened. Thirdly, the freebooters and plunderers who infest all countries, and ours perhaps as little as any other whatever. These men have that natural antipathy to any kind or sort of government that a rogue has to a halter. In number they are few indeed. Such characters are the offspring of dissipation and want, and there is not that country in the world where so much real property is shared so equally among so few citizens. For where property is easily acquired by fair means, very few indeed will resort to foul. Lastly, by the poor mob, in Felix Pecus, the property of whoever will feed them and take care of them. Let them be spared. Let the burden of taxation sit lightly on their shoulders. But alas, this is not their fate. It is here that government forever falls with all its weight. It is here that the proposed government will press where it should scarcely be felt. In this third class may be counted men of the greatest mental powers and of as sublime virtue as any in America. They at present command nearly 1/3 of the property and above half the numbers of the United States, and in either event they must continue to increase in influence by great desertions from both the other classes. If the proposed government is not adopted, theirs will be the prevalent opinion. The object of this class either is or will be purely federal, a union of independent states, not a government of individuals. And should the proposed federal plan fail, from the obstinacy of those who will listen to no conditional amendments, although such as they cannot disapprove, or should it ultimately in its execution upon a fair trial disappoint the wishes and expectations of our country, then a union purely federal is what the reasonable and dispassionate patriots of America must bend their views to. My countrymen, preserve your jealousy, reject suspicion. It is the fiend that destroys public and private happiness. I know some weak, but very few, if any, wicked men in public confidence. And learn this most difficult and necessary lesson, that on the preservation of parties, public liberty depends. Whenever men are unanimous on great public questions, whenever there is but one party, freedom ceases and despotism commences. The object of a free and wise people should be so to balance parties, that from the weakness of all you may be governed by the moderation of the combined judgments of the whole, not tyrannized over by the blind passions of few individuals. A Farmer. End of letter number 4, section number 52, recorded by Robert Scott, June the 18th, 2007. Vox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Scott. The Anti-Federalist Papers, Section 53, Letter number 5. A Farmer, Letter number 5, the 25th of March, 1788. I have been long since firmly persuaded that there are no hidden sources of moral agency beyond the reach of investigation. The all-wise and all-bountiful author of nature could never have created human reason unequal to the happy regulation of human conduct. The errors and misfortunes of mankind spring from obvious sources. Religious and political prejudices, formed by education, strengthened by habit, maintained by interest, and consecrated by fear, are forever arming the passions against the judgment. The celebrated Blaise Pascal, the powers of whose understanding were rather miraculous than surprising, closed his painful researches after religious truth with this dogma, as pernicious as untrue, that a religion purely spiritual was never intended for mankind. There can be no judgment more unbiased, for there was no mind so strong, no heart more pure, but bred in the bosom of the Church. Even her idolatry impressed him with veneration and awe. Notwithstanding his conclusion, the doctrines of Calvin maintain their ground in their primitive simplicity, divested of the aid of ceremony and form. The thunders of the Vatican, which for ages deluged Europe with blood, have dissipated their force, and reason has resumed her spiritual empire. Would to God that the history of temporal despotism had terminated as favorably for the happiness of mankind. In the political world, the chains of civil power, upheld by the numerous links of private interest, have proved more equal and permanent in their effects. They have, and I fear forever must, shackle the human understanding, and it is much to be questioned whether the full and free political opinion of any one great luminary of science has been fairly disclosed to the world. Even when the great and amiable Montesquieu had hazarded a panegyric on the English Constitution, he shrinks back with terror into this degrading apostrophe. Quote, "Think not that I mean to undervalue other governments. I, who think an excess of liberty, an excess of all things, even of reason itself, a misfortune, and that the happiness of mankind is only to be found in a medium between two extremes." End quote. The author of the Persian letters at that moment recollected the afflicting pressure he had felt from the hand of Gallic government, and his pen trembled as he wrote. Is it then possible that governments of simplicity and equal right can have been fairly dealt by in theory or practice? The votaries of tyranny and usurpation stand not alone in bitter opposition. Every man of enterprise, of superior talents and fortune, is interested to debase them. Their banners have ever been deserted because they never can pay their troops. The most amiable and sensible of mankind seem to have made a stand in favor of a mixed government founded on the permanent orders and objects of men. Thither, I suspect, the American government is now tending. If it must be so, let it go gently then, with slow and equal steps. Let each gradation and experiment have a full and fair trial. Let there be no effect without a good, apparent, and well-considered cause. Let us live all the days of our lives, and as happily as circumstance will permit. Finally, let moderation be our guide, and the influence of manners will conduct us, I hope without injury, to some permanent, fixed establishment, where we may repose a while, unagitated by alteration or revolution. For in sudden and violent changes, how many of the most worthy of our fellow citizens must get their bones crushed? I cannot think that any able and virtuous citizen would, in his cool and dispassionate moments, wish to blend or risk the fundamental rights of men with any organization of society that the Americans can or will make for 50 years to come. Let us keep these rights of individuals, these unalienable blessings, reserved and separate from every constitution and form. If they are unmingled, the attentive eyes of every citizen wilt be kept fixed upon them. We shall watch them as a sacred deposit, and we may carry them uninjured and unimpaired through every vicissitude and change, from the government we have left into some other that may be established on the fixed and solid principles of reason. Nor can there be, I imagine, any prudent man who would trust the whimsical inventions of the day with that dangerous weapon, a standing army, in our present unsettled circumstances, striving to substantiate inefficient and unnatural forms. It would wield us into despotism in a moment, and we have surely had throat-cutting enough in our day. Throughout the world, government by representation seems only to have been established to disgrace itself and be abolished. Its very principle is change, and it sets all systems at defiance. It perishes by speedy corruption. The few representatives can always corrupt themselves by legislative speculations from the pockets of their numerous constituents. Quick rotation, like a succession of terms tenants on a farm, only increases the evil by rendering them more rapacious. If the executive is changeable, he can never oppose large decided majorities of influential individuals, or enforce on those powerful men who may render his next election the rigor of equal law, which is the grand and only object of human society. If the executive is to be rendered ineligible for a certain period, he will either not do his duty, or he will retire into the unprotected situation of a private individual, with all the sworn animosities of a powerful majority, aristocracy, junto, the cry of the populace, or perhaps the whole combined to pursue him to the grave or a public execution. The considerate and good who adorn private life, and such only can be safely trusted in high public station, will never commit themselves to a situation where a conscientious discharge of duty may embitter the evening of life, if not draw down ruin and infamy on themselves and families. There was never but one man who stepped from the top to the bottom without breaking his neck, and that was Sylla. And although it is true that whilst he was up, he broke the hearts of the Romans, yet his dying, undisturbed in private life, is one of those miracles that must remain forever unexplained. If the aristocracy, or representation of wealth, the principle of which order is to keep all things as they are, for by confusion they may lose more than they gain, is also changeable, there then is nothing fixed and permanent in government. Legislative tyranny commences, and exhibits a perpetual scene of plunder and confusion, fearlessly practiced under the sanction of authority and law. It is true that the influence of manners may and will resist for a time, yet that must give way to a general and prevalent corruption. Those who are respectable at home and have permanent in life, and such only can give stability to government, will not suffer themselves to be mounted upon the wheel of fortune, to be let down again as it turns, the mockery of children and fools. Where representation has been admitted as a component part of government, it has always proved defective, if not destructive. What, then, must be the consequent where the whole government is founded on representation? Every American can now answer. It will be at best but representation of government. With us, the influence of manners has been great. It is indeed declining fast, but, aided by the solidity of the judiciary establishments and the wisest code of civil laws that ever mankind was blessed with, it has hitherto supported the forms of society. But The people are now weary of their representatives and their governments. We may trace the progress. One candidate to recommend his pretensions discloses and descants on the errors of the preceding administration. The people believe him and are deceived. They change men, but measures are still the same, or injured by the sudden and violent alteration of the system. At least the next candidate asserts it is so, is again believed, and his constituents again deceived. A general disgust and sudden silence ensues. Elections are deserted. Government is first despised and then cordially hated. There can be no fixed and permanent government that does not rest on the fixed and permanent orders and objects of mankind. Government on paper may amuse, but we pay dear for the amusement. The only fixed and permanent order with us at present are the yeomanry, and they have no power whatever, unless the right of changing masters at a certain period, and devolving on their changeable representatives their whole political existence, may be called power. The order of gentry with us is not a fixed and permanent order at all, and if they attempt to erect themselves into one at present, it is usurpation, and they will be pulled down. And yet, in my opinion, such an order is essential to a perfect government founded on representation. Every other mode of introducing wealth into power has proved vicious and abominable. With us, delegates become, by selection, themselves a species of subaltern aristocracy. They intrigue with the senates, who by a refined mode of election are a misbegotten, side-blow representation of wealth, and they both form an imperfect aristocracy on the worst principles on which that order can be admitted into government. And the democratic influence, which is thus amalgamated and not divided, but unformed, becomes vicious from its impotence. These defects spring from our attempting to erect republican fabrics on the ruined and imperfect pillars of an old corrupt monarchy, not less absurd than to expect the limbs to perform the functions of life after cutting off the head. The opposition which brought Charles I to the block was composed of some of the ablest and most virtuous characters that ever adorned any age or clime: Hampden, Pym, Selden, Sir Harry Vane, Sidney, Marvell, and many others. They pursued their old model, attempted to form a government by representation, which was at first steadied and restrained by the best Senate in the world, the English House of Lords. The two houses soon disagreed, and there being no third power to interpose, the representatives voted the House of Lords useless, new modeled the government into a single branch, and then began to plunder most unmercifully. At last Cromwell kicked them all out of doors, and after his tyrannical usurpation and death, the nation were very happy to take shelter again under the regal government, and even restored an unworthy family which they had irritated beyond forgiveness to the throne. A farmer. To be continued. 28 March 1788. Continued from our last. After every consideration I can give this subject, I am satisfied that government founded on representation indispensably requires at least an executive for life, whose person must be sacred from impeachment, and only his ostensible ministers responsible. A Senate for life, the vacancies to be filled up, and the number occasionally increased, but under a limitation, by the executive. The hand that holds the balance must have the power of adding weight and influence to the lightest scale, and of frequently removing turbulent men into a higher and inoffensive situation. I am inclined to think that an important portion of American opinion leans that way at this moment. My fear is that our general government may ultimate in a hereditary authority, if not despotism. To avoid the former, great attention should be paid to the important office of vice president, at present but little understood. A vice president, to succeed on a vacancy, prevents those evils which have ruined Poland and all the northern kingdoms. Thus, we see the King of the Romans has secured Germany from every evil of elective monarchy, and had the Golden Bull prevented one of the family or kindred of the reigning emperor from filling the office of the King of the Romans, this part of the Germanic constitution would have been perfect, and the House of Austria would never have been enabled to usurp the imperial crown as a patrimony and desolate Europe with her ambitious views. She would have continued in that beggarly condition from which Randolph of Hapsburg raised it. The American Constitution is much better guarded, but not by any means completely so. If this is the best we can hope for, if this is the best reward we can expect for the sons of America slain, and the distresses we shall long continue to feel, is it not incumbent on us to examine minutely all its consequences? Let us view government by representation in its favorite form, the Constitution of England. Its uncommon success and length of duration there has drawn on it very unmerited encomiums from the enlightened Genevan de Lone, the only great political writer who does not seem to hold representation in contempt. Indeed, the viewing it through this favorable medium has always animated our hopes, and led many sensible Americans to imagine this old and universal experiment to be peculiar to that isle. In pursuing my inquiry into the principles and effects of the British government, I shall first grant that it is a rational system founded on solid, safe principles, and one of the best governments for the higher ranks of mankind in the world. But then I must insist that it was hardly a government at all until it became simplified by the introduction and regular formation of the effective administration of responsible ministers on its present system, which we cannot date higher up than the appointment of Lord Stafford and others by Charles I. Moreover, I do not know how far the system of bribery introduced by Sir Robert Walpole and the influence of the numerous body of public creditors are not now absolutely necessary to its present stability. And, after all, I am not satisfied how such a simplification as would produce a responsibility can be effected in a government complicated by so many subordinate and powerful corporations as the American states will be. And yet, responsibility must be attained, and an easy and certain mode adopted of changing measures and men without commotion, or liberty will be lost in the attempt. I am confused and bewildered when I arrive at this point of reflection, and despotism meets me at every turn. There are but two modes of governing mankind: by just and equal law, enforced impartially on all ranks of society, or by the sword. If such laws cannot be obtained, or the attainment is attended with too much difficulty, the sword will supply their place. Et inter arma leges silent. When arms command, the laws are disobeyed. Shall we have patience with the disorders of our complicated machine? As Alexander dissolved the Gordian knot with the sword, so I fear a standing army will simplify the governments of America. I have said that the government of England afforded firm protection of property. It certainly does so, comparatively speaking. Yet the history of its frequent revolutions will discover that even property is insecure there. During the civil wars in which the Stuarts involved this nation, 2/3 of the property of the kingdom changed masters, and in those between Lancaster and York, and before the firm establishment of the line of Tudor, almost all the old families perished, and their property became dissipated. And yet, its protection of property is its favorable side. Turn your eyes to the lower order of citizens, and they are pressed into the earth by taxation and imposition. Very rarely will industry enable the husbandman to rear a family. Where the sons of agriculture are so poorly rewarded, government must be ulcerated to the heart. The miserable poor, who pursue the dictates of nature and religion, in that connection which is destined to sweeten the bitter draught of life, are commonly handed from constable to constable, until their unfortunate birth compels some parish to own them. The people of England have always and forever will emigrate. The people of England never repair to arms to repel foreign invasion, and they never will unless compelled. To conquer England, it would only seem necessary from past example to escape their floating defenses and land on the island, passing by former invasions and conquests. As late as the year 1745, Prince Charles Edward, at the head of an undisciplined rabble belonging to some Highland clans attached to his family, marched undisturbed through the most populous counties in the heart of the kingdom, and the capital, containing 200,000 fighting men, trembled for its safety at the approach of an unexperienced boy, followed by 4,000 or 5,000 half-armed peasants. Scarcely a man in the kingdom shouldered a musket until the danger disappeared, and government owed its safety to the protection of foreign mercenaries, or rather the weakness and irresolution of the assailant. The fact is, the people will never fight if they can help it, for representatives, taxes, and rags. Let us now contrast this scene with one where the people personally exercise the powers of government. The three small democratic cantons of Uri, Schwitz, and Underwald broke the chains of their former servitude and laid the foundation of the Swiss Confederacy. They effected the revolution, and in conjunction with other democratic cantons and their democratic allies, the Orisons, have supported the grand fabric of Hellevic liberty to this day. Every Swiss farmer is by birth a legislator, and he becomes a voluntary soldier to defend his power and his property. Their fathers have been so before them for nearly 500 years, without revolution and almost without commotion. They have been the secure spectators of the constant and universal destruction of the human species, which the usurpations of the few have ever created, and must, I fear, forever perpetuate. Whilst all Europe were butchering each other for the love of God and defending the usurpations of the clergy under the mask of religion, the malignant evil crept into this sacred asylum of liberty. But where the government resides, in the body of the people, they can never be corrupted by the artifice or the wealth of the few. They soon banished the daemon of discord, and Protestant and Papist sat down under the peaceful shade of the same tree, whilst in every surrounding state and kingdom the son was dragging the father and the brothers, their brothers, to the scaffold under the sanction of these distinctions. Thus these happy Helvetians have in peace and security beheld all the rest of Europe become a common slaughterhouse. A free Swiss acquires from his infancy a knowledge of the fundamental laws of his country, and the leading principles of their national policy are handed down by tradition from father to son. The first of these is never to trust power to representatives or a national government. A free Swiss pays no taxes. On the contrary, he receives taxes. Every male of 16 years shares near 10 shillings sterling annually, which the rich and powerful surrounding monarchies pay for the friendship of those manly farmers. Whenever their societies become too large, as government belongs to the citizens, and the citizens are the property of no government, they divide amicably, and each separate part pursues the simple form recommended by their ancestors, and becomes venerable by the glorious and happy experience of ages of prosperity. Their frugal establishments are chiefly supported by the pay which the officers of government receive from the services they render individuals. With a country the most unfriendly to industry in the world, they have become, in a series of years, passed in uninterrupted but moderate labor, frugality, peace, and happiness, the richest nation under the sun. I have seen a computation by which it appeared that the interest of the money they have beforehand and that which is due them from the rich nations of Europe would support themselves and their posterity forever, without further exertion, and this whilst every other government is actually as much or more in debt than it is worth. An intelligent author has remarked that passing from a democratic to an aristocratic canton of Switzerland, you quit the society of men to contemplate the regular labor of brutes. They are compelled, indeed, in the aristocratic cantons, to be extremely moderate in their government, and to lay few or no taxes, or they would drive their subjects into the neighboring free states. As it is, they are well clothed, well fed, and taken good care of. The same author remarks that the line which separates all Switzerland from the countries around, where men, like cattle, are the property of their proud lords and kept chained to the soil, is the line of division between light and darkness, between happiness and horror. The love of Switzers for their country is altogether romantic and surpasses the bounds of credibility. Those memorable relations, authenticated by the common consent of all historians, of their beating on all occasions the flower of the Austrian and French troops who have invaded them with numbers so unequal and trifling as scarce to exceed their enemies' outguards, the instances of hundreds of citizens devoting their lives for the safety of their country, of their frequently disdaining life and refusing quarter when overpowered by numbers, have astonished and terrified the neighboring powers, and seem incomprehensible to a people dispirited by taxes, overloaded with debts, and disgusted with government. I cannot omit a striking characteristic, authenticated by Cox and others, whose authority will not be questioned. They relate that there is a rustic tune familiar in the mountains of Switzerland. It is called the Rance des Vaux. It consists of a few simple notes of native wild melody. The French and Dutch governments have been compelled to forbid, under very severe penalties, the playing of this woodland music to those Swiss troops, which they hire for a limited time. The well-known notes revive instantly all the fond images which are impressed on their youthful bosom, their friends, their parents, their relations, and their beloved country rush into their imaginations in a full tide of affection. No persuasion can detain them. They desert home in regiments, or if retained by force, they pine away in the deepest melancholy. No instance has yet occurred of Swiss troops serving in any part of Europe who have not returned with the diligence and anxiety of affectionate children on the first appearance of danger to their parent country. The same amour patrie, the same divine love of their country, universally pervades the bosom of every citizen, who in his right of birth legislates for himself. Grossly relates that he saw in Rome a poor fellow, who had traveled through great part of Europe and Asia afoot, declaiming to a crowd with the most passionate zeal in praise of his own country, boasting of her happiness, and preferring San Marino to all the world besides. This democratic republic is a little beehive of free citizens, who have made a delicious garden of the top of a bleak barren mountain, situated in the midst of the finest and most fruitful plains of Italy, which tyranny has depopulated around them. Look into the human breast. We love that power which we exercise ourselves, but we detest that which others exercise over us, be they representatives, lords, or kings, and to this source we may trace the abuse which the Americans bestow on their country and their governments. But we are told that Switzerland should be no example for us. I am very sorry for it. They are the only part of the human species that sustains the dignity of character belonging to the divine resemblance we bear. They are few in number, it is said. This is not true. They are more numerous than we are. They cover a small spot of territory. This is also not true. They possess a large tract of country in the very heart of Europe, but this is not all. The Helvetic Confederacy, including the 3 leagues of the Orisons, comprehends 100, perhaps 200, independent governments and states. Nor is there any reason for their history or present state to doubt that the same plan of confederation might not be extended with as lasting and happy effects to 1,000 independent governments. But it is also said they are a poor, frugal people. As to their poverty, that is likewise untrue. They have great sums of money beforehand, and owe not a sixpence. They indeed are wise, and consequently a frugal people, though they still have great estates, and even luxury among them too. But should we despair their poverty or their frugality? We who are so many millions worse than nothing? But still, we are told we must not take example from them. We must take example from Holland and Germany. They had better at once tell us that we must desert the worship of God and follow that of the devil. From the first dawn of light that broke in upon my reason, I became devoted to governments of simplicity and equal right. The names of heroes whose blood has bedewed the altars of freedom vibrate like the shock of electricity on my frame, and when I read the story of Brutus and of Cassius, the most noble and last of the Romans, tears of admiration gush from my eyes. Under these impressions, which only the grave can erase, I feel unspeakable horror at every step which removes power and rights at a greater distance from the body of the people to whom they belong, and confines them in the hands of the few. I have proposed to myself this question: if representatives cannot govern the people, if they abuse the power entrusted to them, shall they devolve this power on a still smaller number, who must be more liable to corruption from the increase of temptation? Or should they restore it into the hands of the people from whom they received it, who alone are incorruptible, because the wealth of the few can never bribe the many against the duty they owe to themselves? If I am told that the people are incapable of governing themselves, I shall answer that they have never been tried in America except among the native Indians, who are free and happy, and who prove that self-government is the growth of our soil. And I also answer that they are more fit for self-government than they are at present for any of the safe and solid governments founded on representation. When I see all these principles established by the example of the Swiss, who have remained under the simplest of all forms of government for near 500 years, in uninterrupted tranquility and happiness, whilst every other invention of genius, devise of art, or imposition offeree has been torn up by the roots with every aggravated circumstance of horror, I can no longer doubt. All the mists of theory and speculation vanish before an experiment like this. The greatest human discernment ever concentrated in the mind of one man was the portion of the celebrated Nicholas Machiavelli, a name loaded with abuse by tyrants, flatterers, and the mushrooms of science, because he told the truth, because he was a republican and the friend of mankind in times of usurpation, or because they have never read or do not understand his works. After every inquiry which the most unbounded information and reflection, with a long experience in high public office afforded, Machiavelli delivers his deliberate opinion in favor of the body of the people, as the only safe depository of liberty and power. He prefers it to the aristocracy and the prince, but he does not disgrace the inquiry by mentioning representation. If this was the opinion of Machiavelli, a citizen of Florence, where a numerous populace, confined and crowded within the walls of a city, formed the most turbulent republic that ever disgraced the cause of freedom by cruelty and anarchy, how much more favorably must his decision apply to the yeomanry of America, landholders, and consequently the most independent of mankind, mild by nature, moderate by manners, and persevering in every honest pursuit. Surely, if ever men were worthy of being entrusted with their own rights, the freeholders of America are. Make them, then, and their posterity, legislators by birth. I mean not the lowest populace, I mean that class of citizens to whom this country belongs. Numbers unqualified by property should have their influence. They should be protected. They might preserve the right of election, but they who hold the property of the soil are alone entitled to govern it. To effect this, there would need be little change in the present forms. They might all stand, but the laws which pass the legislature before they become binding should be referred to the different counties and cities. Printed reasons drawn by committees might, if necessary, accompany each, together with an annual estimate of public wants and a detail of the expenditures of former sums granted. Let these laws be submitted to the free deliberation of the freeholders of the counties and cities. The numbers of the yeas and nays be taken on each by the presiding magistrate and transmitted to the executive, who may then, upon comparing the returns from the several counties and corporations, declare what laws are the will of the people. On the appearance of any sudden danger, the two houses, or indeed a majority of one house, might invest the executive with the authority exigency might require for the safety of the republic until remedy should be provided by law. The number of representatives might be decreased and an expense saved. This would at one blow destroy all legislative speculations. The influence of demagogues or oligarchic juntos must then cease. The assemblage of the freeholders, separate in different counties, would prevent disturbance. As no new law could be made in them, little confusion would ensue. After some years, or even immediately, if confined to future cases, the celebrated law of Geneva might be introduced, and no freeholder admitted to the assembly until he had paid his father's debts. Sumptuary laws permitting the use but prohibiting the abuse of wealth might be interposed to guard the public manners. The governor and 2 members of the Senate might constitute a council of censors to punish offenders against the sumptuary laws and the laws of morality by a removal from office, and even disenfranchisement if necessary, with an appeal to the people of the county where the offender resides in the later case, and to the people of the state in the former. Seminaries of useful learning with professorships of political and domestic. Economy might be established in every county. Discarding the philosophy of the moon and skies, we might descend to teach our citizens what is useful in this world. The principles of free government, illustrated by the history of mankind, the sciences of morality, agriculture, commerce, the management of farms and household affairs. The light would then penetrate where mental darkness now reigns. Do these things, and in a very few years the people, instead of abusing, would wade up to their knees in blood to defend their governments. For some years past, this has been the darling object of my life, to which all my views have tended, and I now think that nothing intermediate would be lasting or worthy the pursuit. Whenever I fairly lose sight of this, as soon as I turn my back forever on these dear illusions, which will be as soon as the proposed federal government is adopted, I shall turn all my wishes to that social state whither that government will lead us, and I both hope and expect that with those amendments and guards which it seems to be the general disposition to provide, it will gradually mature in a safe and reasonable government. Until that adoption, I speak to my fellow citizens in the words of the proverb, "Do not that by others which you can do yourselves." A Farmer. End of Letter 5, Section 53. Recorded by Robert Scott, June the 19th, 2007.